Greetings to you all our viewers and listeners living and working in different parts of the world. Welcome to yet another episode of The Conversation. Today, my special guest is Dr. Clement Masakure, who is the head of the Department of History at the University of the Free State in South Africa. Dr. Clement Masakure recently published a book entitled African Nurses and Everyday Work in 20th Century Zimbabwe. This book was published by Manchester University Press. Dr. Clement Masakure, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chikumbu, for inviting me to your program. I'm looking forward to sharing at least my few insights on nursing history, nursing humanities, medical history, and histories of hospitals, with a particular focus on colonial and post-colonial Zimbabwe.
That is wonderful. Thank you very much for that. I'm also happy to have been joined by many other participants on this discussion. I'm joined by a whole lot of people. I could possibly introduce everybody here, but let me just move on with the discussion and then get to start. Dr. Clement Masakure, you congratulations on this good job. Would like to get to start quickly and then open the floor for questions to the participants that we have. If you can just give us a brief outline of your book and its main ideas and possibly what you consider to be the central argument, if not arguments.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to try and share the screen. This is my first time doing this. I hope I'll be very much successful. So let's see. All right. I think, yeah, I think we're good to go. Colleagues, this book has a very long story, a long journey. Started as a PhD thesis, and I would like to thank my advisors at Minnesota, and then transformed into a book, especially under the International Studies Group at University of the Free State under Prof. Mister. And then I completed it when I was employed in the history department. I also would like to thank Manchester University Press for giving me the opportunity to showcase at least my work to the world. So on the screen is an image, and it's courtesy of the National Archives of Zimbabwe. And it's entitled The Treatment of Leprosy. I actually have, at least within the book, two images on the treatment of leprosy, which is something else which I'm going to in future work on. The image shows a leprosy patient and two nurses, an African and a European in the dispensary. The African nurse in a dark dress and wearing gloves is treating the leprosy patient. The white nurse in a white uniform is most likely instructing the African nurse on where to apply the medication. The image is about a teaching moment as much as it demonstrates a healing process. It also reveals the relations between the patient and the healers themselves, especially black and white in colonial and at times post-colonial Zimbabwe. It is about a colonial institution and of course a post-colonial institution, the clinic, or if it's a bigger healing space, the hospital. That was to transform, that is clinics and hospitals were to transform the healing landscape in 20th century Zimbabwe. And we should remember hospitals are colonial institutions that came into being, especially after the colonization of Zimbabwe in 1890. Plugged in time, the image also sums up the nature of work and the people who dispense medicine within Zimbabwe's hospital for close to a century. The African nurse, with the guidance of the European nurse, was the central figure in dispensing biomedicine to her fellow African patients. It is therefore a story that undergirds the study the African nurse and everyday work in Zimbabwe's hospital in the 20th century. In this book, I put under a historical inquiry the role of African healthcare workers in their different capacities within hospitals in colonial and post-colonial Zimbabwe. I start with the examination of the early medical auxiliaries in the early 1900s. And that is a picture of an early mission clinic, and again, courtesy of the National Archives. And one can see a medical auxiliary treating a patient, and there's another person actually watching the process. Then I move on to analyze the experience of mission-trained nurses in the 1930s. And on my left is a picture of Sister Marge Dry of Wildlife Mission, just outside of Marondera. And she was the first to formally train mission nurses in colonial Zimbabwe. And this process started in the 1930s. And of course, on my right is, at least on my right, is a medical auxiliary who's treating a patient. Then from the nurses in the 1930s, it moves on to government-trained nursing orderlies who were principal authorities in rural clinics in the 1940s and 1950s, and even going into the 1960s decade. And again, the picture which I share with you is an outdoor African clinic, again, courtesy of the National Archives. As you can see, the medical orderly is treating a child, and there are women who are sitting around. I moved into the 1950s and 60s decade with an examination of what we call the African state registered nurses and their daily work. And on this picture indicated Harare Hospital Trainees, 1950. The picture must have been taken just after 1958 or between 58 and 1962. This is the group of first women, at least at Harare Hospital, which was built, which came into operation in 1958 to train as state-registered nurses. The other school where African women were trained as state-registered nurses was at Impilo Hospital, which is based in Bulawayo. I then move on to the 1970s decade, and I focus on the impact of the War of Liberation on, and especially the impact of the war on nurses in urban and rural hospitals. And I was also a bit daring in examining the experience of medics and nurses within liberation movements in what we call bush hospitals, especially in Mozambique. I mainly focus on Mozambique under the Zanla forces. With the coming of independence, I move on to examine the role of nurses in a new Zimbabwe. And of course, the impact of HIV and AIDS in the 90s, and the impact of austerity measures that were adopted by the government. And this, I look at the impact of austerity measures and HIV AIDS on the daily work of nurses in the 1990s. I end with the 1996 strike, which I argue is a watershed moment in the history of nursing in Zimbabwe. It was the biggest strike, and after that strike, many nurses, quite a large number of nurses, began moving abroad. And we know that in history, we do have quite a number of nurses who were trained in Zimbabwe who are working either in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in New Zealand, and some even in the United States. Through privileging the experience of the subordinates, I take African nurses as subordinates, and this will come out very soon. I use the case of healing spaces to examine colonial relations. I argue that the hospital relations replicate larger social relations. As in South Africa, the structure and organization of hospital bureaucracy reflected the broader societal structures. At the top of the pyramid were hospital administrators and medical doctors who were white, and especially during the colonial period, and followed by white nurses and matrons, white nurses, white sisters. At the base of the pyramid were African nurses who bore the weight of tending the infirm. Even in the post-colonial period, with the completion of what I call the Africanization of the hospital system, and this Africanization, which saw more Africans being appointed to senior position that started in the 1960s and of course was completed in post-colonial period. But even with this Africanization of the hospital system that began in the 1960s and going into the post-colonial period, the structure of the hospital remained very much a colonial one. Black hospital administrators, Black matrons and sisters in charge perpetuated the former hospital relations as was done in the past, with the majority of nurses constituting the fulcrum of the smooth functioning of the hospital system. In shouldering the burden of hospital work over the 20th century, African nurses in their various categories and generations, female and male, used the opportunity to carve a niche for themselves within Zimbabwean hospitals. In the process, they made clinical spaces their own, and I think this is very important in the sense that these were colonial institutions where we do have African nurses more or less as subordinates. But in my book, time again and again, I demonstrate how they were in charge of the everyday running of the hospital. African nurses used their presence in hospitals to highlight their potential and expertise. Early medical auxiliaries, nursing orderlies, state registered nurses, and guerrilla medics, for example, were bastions of the healing spaces they controlled. And beyond the gaze and reach of officials and superiors, whether as advanced male nursing orderlies in the 1930s and 40s, whether as junior nurses from the 1950s onwards, or as advanced clinical nurses in the 1970s, or as guerrilla medics, these various types of nurses became de facto medical authorities. This is significant for nursing history. As de facto medical authorities, nurses had control over their work and yielded power within the clinic and beyond the clinic. The power that was elusive to many in African during the long 20th century. They acquired knowledge associated with biomedicine, diagnosed diseases, and made decisions on the nature of treatment. And even if it meant referring patients to the next nursing or medical authority higher on the chain of command, it was in itself a demonstration of the authority on nursing and medical issues that was a privilege for the few, at least those who were trained to be nurses. In addition, as de facto authorities within clinical spaces, nurses in their various capacities also blurred the boundaries between nursing practices and medical work. We know that nurses are supposed to do what they're trained to do, to nurse patients. But in certain cases, and especially in rural outposts, for example, they actually also practice medical work, which was in most cases, and especially during the colonial period, a preserve for medical doctors. I also highlight the significance of African nurses' intermediary position within healing spaces. As cultural interlocutors, or to quote Nancy Rosand, as middles, African nurses were central in translating African conceptions of afflictions to white medical personnel, simultaneously translated Western medicine to African patients. Toward this end, nurses drew upon their cultural understanding of disease causation in helping patients comprehend and negotiate different healing options that were presented by the presence of clinics and hospitals. Closely related to what I've just said, I stress the idea that the sphere of nursing became an arena in which Africans helped reshape Western and African meanings of caregiving, and at the same time reformulated the local care economy. The hospital environment enabled nurses to cross the cultural nursing boundaries, in the process reshaping Africans. And here, when I mean by Africans, I mean nurses themselves, but also patients. So in terms of reshaping Africans' understanding of taking care of the sick and tending the infirm. For example, through an examination of young women experiences in the post-1950 period, that is the women who became state registered nurses in the 1950s, I demonstrate how these young African nurses adjusted to seeing strangers' bodies, especially male bodies, as well as probing health and diseased body parts as part of their daily work. Furthermore, I note how nursing older patients presented a major cultural challenge to young African women. With time, nurses got used to it. I know right now it's something which we take for granted, but at one historical moment, at one time in history, this was something new, and especially for African nurses. I don't know whether you guys can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes,
That's
yes,
why.
yes, I can.
Yes, no, I heard voices in the background.
I think one of our participants might need to mute his or her microphone.
All right, thank you very much. That's why young women push the boundaries of traditional understanding of nursing through their presence in clinical spaces. The normalization which we actually experience right now because we think it's normal, but at a particular historical moment, it was not. The normalization of earlier anxieties was one of the ways in which African nurses reshaped their cultural understanding of nursing. Scattered within nursing history is an examination of nurses' hopes and aspiration for actually choosing the profession. I feel this gap in the historiography, and I highlight that in an environment that limited women's opportunity, and especially for the women who became nurses in the post-1950 period, in an environment, I highlight that in an environment that limited women's opportunities because of their gender and race, African women use nursing as a ladder to secure a better life for themselves and their families. By doing this, I'm trying to look at what were the push factors for some of these women to say, I'm going to choose nursing, for instance, as a career opportunity. Of course, there were few career opportunities. Teaching, for instance, was one, or being a clerk was one. But of course, we know in the 60s, 70s, more opportunities were opened for African women. So what I try to do by looking at, by trying to look at this aspiration, I'm trying to understand what's happening in private, but also then make a connection with the public sphere and how then this pushes women to be employed within the public sector. And this is an area that is usually understudied within nursing history. So if I can cap, and there you can see it's actually the cover page of my book. And again, it's a process where it's a healing process. By this time, it's a medical doctor, and an African nurse. Again, she's holding the tray, showing a raw. And of course, we do have again another leprosy patient. So informed by the memories of this nurse, and I did quite a number of interviews, I highlight the experiences of men and women, trained and untrained nurses, and I can talk a bit more about these ideas of trained and untrained nurses and what it meant. Mission nurses and government nurses, orderlies who at times classified as nursing orderlies, but sometimes just classified as orderlies, but who also did nursing work. And of course, also highlight the experience of guerrilla medics. And this is of a period of close to a century. In their various capacities and within different healing spaces in which they worked, these healthcare workers transformed the hospitals to make their own. In the process, they reshaped and reformulated indigenous as well as Western nursing and biomedical practices. Through their work, they contributed to the development of the nation by being at the bedside, healing the sick and nursing the infirm. And I would like to argue that they're actually doing a very great job these days, especially if you want to think of the frontline workers and how they're dealing with COVID. And especially in Zimbabwe, where they are working with extremely limited resources. Thank you very much.
That is wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Clement Masakure. Viewers and listeners, this was Dr. Clement Masakure. He is a senior lecturer and also the head of the Department of History at the University of the Free State in South Africa. This was a presentation of his newly published book that is entitled African Nurses and Everyday Work in 20th Century Zimbabwe. This book was published by Manchester University Press in 2020. My dear participants who are joining me right on the Zoom, this is the question segment. I'm happy to take your questions that are directed to Dr. Clement Masakure. So just indicate by raising your hand or showing an emoji of a hand that is raised so that I can admit you, so that you can ask the question. I'm going to start with Dr. Munya Munochiwei. This is your time.
Oh, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
I can, Munya.
Yes, of course. Congratulations again, my friend, fellow alumni of the University of Minnesota, Clement. I mean, Clement and I and other Zimbabweans were sort of all in the trenches of doctoral studies in the frigid temperatures of Minnesota a few years ago. But anyway, I wanted you to explain further, on the notion of the sort of Africanization of biomedicine, right, in a colonial context. Indeed, the idea of Africanization, right, has been sort of a powerful concept of understanding sort of, colonial or Western institutions ever since, our advisor, right, I mean, at Minnesota, Allen Isaacman, wrote a very important book that he titled, I think, Mozambique, the Africanization of a European institution. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So a very important paradigm of understanding colonial subjectivity, right? So can you sort of share briefly? I mean, I heard you perhaps in passing, maybe talking a little bit about that, but can you share briefly how these concepts of really help you to explore your research on this very important topic?
All right. Thank you, Munya. I won't say Africanization of biomedicine because, of course, biomedicine is a very loaded term, and I don't look at biomedicine in the book. I argue for the Africanization of a particular institution, of course, where biomedicine is practiced, and it is practiced by both black and white, or if you want to add. So-called colored and like Indian. But in terms of the Africanization here, this is a very, at least in the book, it's a very simplified term in terms of thinking of the transformation in terms of the structure of the hospital in colonial Zimbabwe, and especially in terms of who occupy which position within the hierarchy of the hospital system. You do understand that if you think of it, the early hospital being Salisbury General Hospital, being Mutare General Hospital, or the Gwelo one, or if you want to think of the old Bulawayo Hospital, and even Mission Hospital, you do have white medical doctors and white nurses being in charge in terms of decision making, in terms of having the authority and the final say, right? But then you do have, a host of medical auxiliaries who are of a different race, but again, who are shouldering the burden. Of course, these in the 1930s, if we're reading within the colonial archives, in the 1930s, and especially in rural areas, these medical auxiliaries and especially male native nursing orderlies are given a bit more power in terms of decision making. So that's where you begin to think about the very idea of who controls the hospital, in terms of the Africanization of the hospital. But it, in terms of officially, it begins in the post-Second World War period, and especially with the expansion of the hospital system, together with the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, that saw, with the establishment of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, that saw a creation of a two-tier system of nurses who worked for the Federation and nurses who worked for the local government. So you begin to see the transformation of the entire structure with quite a number of white nurses being transferred to the federal nursing services. And it opened space for qualified Black women. Some at one point were not at least acknowledged as qualified. And because of their arrest, a few began to be incorporated within that decision making body. You begin to see, for instance, sisters like Sister Nunjoma, being promoted to, to a matron. And I think this, you begin to see a gradual transformation in terms of who give decision-making on who is in charge of hospital. But this does not mean that, they displace white medical and nursing authorities. White and medical and nursing authorities still remain, but you have more Africans taking, being given more responsibilities beyond the ordinary work they're supposed to do. And this continued, and especially in the 1970s, and in part because you do have quite a number of medical personnel and nursing personnel, and especially white medical and nursing personnel, leaving the country because they didn't want to be recruited into, to be co-opted into the army to fight against the liberation movements. So you have, again, quite a number of Africans being incorporated into decision-making. And of course, you do have a deliberate policy by the Smith regime that tried to appeal to internal nationalists by opening up certain spaces to the African middle class. And of course, I argue that the Africanization then is completed in the post-19, with independence, with the coming in of the Hospitals Act of 1980, where they actually created quite a number of positions, and they promoted quite a number of Black nursing personnel. And in the process, again, under the leadership of Dr. Herbert Ushokunze, you begin to see, like a post-colonial transformation of the structure of the nursing services in Zimbabwe. So in terms of the Africanization, Munya, it's about authority, who controls what and how this gradually changes with more Africans being incorporated. But during the colonial period, we should always appreciate that white medical authorities have the final say, even though we do have Blacks being incorporated within the structures.
Thanks so much, Clement.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the question, Dr. Munyamuno Chiwe, and thank you very much for the response, Dr. Clement Masakure. Viewers and listeners, those who have questions directed to Dr. Clement Masakure, just indicate by raising your hand. There is a question that was submitted by Rosa Williams. I'm going to read this question, or I'm going to either invite her to speak. But before I get to do that, since we need to clarify on that, let me admit Dr. Tembi with a question directed to Dr. Clement Masakure. This is your time.
Hi, Clement, and thank you so much for a fascinating discussion and to share your views on about your book. So my question is basically, maybe it's a general question. So I wanted to know if you explore the attitude of nurses during this 20th century period towards especially the Black Africans who were patients. So why I'm asking is that growing up in the late 90s and even now, I think to some extent, you find that there are these negative stereotypes about nurses as being mean and stuff. So do you explore that in your book, and does it also have something to do with their treatment, perhaps, which they received during the colonial period from the white superiors? So it's just out of fascination and out of interest if you're exploring that in your book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tembani. You see, it's what's fascinating is that that's the reason I thought of actually trying to think about. If I would like to think about the genesis of, the entire project. And of course, one is that you're supposed to have a PhD project, which you have to do. But the other comes from my experiences with being more or less close to the hospital. My mother is not a nurse, but she works within the hospital. But also it comes from the experience, and especially in the early 2000s of how nurses were perceived, 2000 thereabout. And again, there is this idea that nurses are mean, rude, they love money, they don't do their work. And to be honest, Tembi, we still have this today, right? And we had that in the 2000s. Reading through the Herald in the 1980s, there are complaints, so many complaints about nurses, again, around the same themes from patients. And if one goes to the African Daily News of 1961, there is few articles about nurses at Harare Hospital. And again, the same problem, pops up. That nurses are rude, they love money, and they're all just interested in their boyfriends. They're not interested in taking care of the sick. I think this emanates first from the very nature of the work, right? In the sense that people then, all of a sudden, because you come in with a patient who is critical, and all of a sudden, and you want someone to feel sorry for them, and everyone wants to be helped quickly. So if someone is not attended to in time, then there is a tendency that, oh no, you know what, the nurses are not doing their job. In my interviews, that was one of the big questions which I asked. Can you tell me, how did patients perceive you guys, and how did patients and their relatives perceive you guys when you started your work? And there's always a sanitization of history, I might say. Most nurses, at least the older nurses I spoke to, who were during that time, they were in their 60s, 70s, and had been within the system for a very long time, and they had retired. They argue that, we treated patients better than present-day nurses. So in other words, they're actually accusing their colleagues of not doing their work. Patients perceived us very well. We did our job, we're dedicated. We went into nursing because it was, and in most cases there was this, it was a calling. And there was an argument that unlike present day nurses were just interested in money. But then you ask the younger nurses, they'll tell you almost the very same thing. So in other words, I think what then we see is usually when people come to hospitals, they expect to be treated or they expect to be attended in a blink of an eye, of course, which is very impossible. They have certain expectations of the profession. And these expectations of profession, it comes from the very nature of the work, in the sense that you're working with patients. We're working with someone who is ill, someone who is helpless. But at the same time, they do not understand the pressures in which nurses themselves are in. They work, and especially if you want to think of Zimbabwean nurses, at least by the time I did the interviews, which might also have affected some of the answers, it was during the height of the Zimbabwe crisis. There is cholera, resources are extremely limited, and if I'm not mistaken, hospitals sometimes closing wards. So you do have pressures on nurses also. that they fail to provide nursing services to patients, it's not because they don't want to, but they actually don't have resources. If one go to, for instance, if I can just if one go to the strike of 1996, again, that point is raised that nurses are supposed to do their job irrespective of the availability or not of resources. But if resources are not there, then how are they going to, I think, do their work? In short, I think I can say that question, I popped it up to the interviewees. They had their own perceptions about it, but I think it comes from the nature of the job, availability of the resources, and what patients and their relatives expect of nurses. Thanks.
That is wonderful. Thank you very much for the response, Dr. Clement Masakure. We have another question and another hand by Blandi Manditeresa. This is your time. This is your time.
Okay, afternoon, everybody. Congratulations, Dr. Masakure. That was profound. I would just like to ask something, maybe it's a contribution. Do you think the treatment that nurses in Zimbabwe do receive has to do with gender? Why I'm saying so, it is because Zimbabwe is a patriarchal society. If you look at other professions, they get the due respect. But with our nurses, like you indicated, is the verbal abuse, the physical abuse, the long working hours, and the underpayment. And if I look at it closely, this thing has been running for ages. That is why I'm asking whether you think it has to do with the gender imbalance in our country.
Thank you, Dr. Mandi, and welcome. I really appreciate your presence, and I hope to give you the book soon when we meet. The issue of gender is extremely central to nursing, but I just want to make it very clear that in my book, I look at, and this was something that was extremely difficult for me, I look at various categories of nurses, and these are male and female nurses. So whilst the majority of nurses are women, we also do have men who do practice nursing. But coming to to your question about gender, I'll say a bit yes, in the sense that if you think about the genesis of modern nursing, right, in the mold of Florence Nightingale, it's mainly women. And the very idea of nursing is you're supposed to be, it should be a calling. So nursing, and unlike if you want to think of medical work, nursing is supposed to be a calling, or medical work is something you do because you want to do. So because nursing has, at least for a very long time, been classified as more or less as a calling, and sometimes associated with nuns, but also with women. And for the most part of the 20th century, at times women who end up not being married, so because they want to be dedicated to their work, there is a tendency then, like the idea that it's a calling, it's a service you are doing to society. There is, in most cases, a tendency to undervalue, like that kind of work. So you're absolutely right. There is something about the gendered nature of the profession that lends it to be undervalued. So if you want to think, for instance, that in my interviews, I noticed that the majority of nurses, at least all the nurses, had more experience than junior doctors. Yet, in terms of remuneration, they were being paid lower than junior doctors. Yet some of junior doctors would actually, inquire about certain cases from those more senior nurses because they've been through the mill for a very long time. So obviously the aspect of gender the issue of, the way the profession itself has been framed for the past 200 centuries, the very idea that it's a calling rather than, an actual job that one can say I'm actually doing has led to nursing being undervalued. And that's why, for instance, I'm actually arguing that then if you want to think of it, the smooth running of any hospital, it cannot run without nurses, because they are the central within the entire wheel of the entire system. If I go to the 1996 strike again, where junior doctors and nurses, they went on a strike, and the government paid junior doctors what they had requested, but did not pay nurses. Hospitals remained closed. So in other words, again, there is an undervalue by the state and by many people. Yet I argue in my book, these women and men are extremely central to the functioning of the hospital system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clement Masakure. We are still taking questions, viewers and listeners. We are still taking questions. Before I get to Dr. Valentine Chambwe, let me bring in Rosa Williams, who is with St. Lawrence University in New York. She has got a question directed to Dr. Clement Masakure. This is your time.
Hi. Firstly, let me apologize to everyone that my family breakfast disrupted part of Dr. Masakure's fascinating talk. Yes, multitasking at breakfast time in the US. And I do apologize. I've managed to free myself now so I can actually speak. This is thrilling to see. I'm very excited to read the book. I feel a little pride in having been in, a shared office space with you when you were working on it. And of course, my question just relates to my own selfish interests, but I guess I have two parts. The first is I'm curious about the transition for nurses who are state or mission nurses in terms of how they identified themselves and their responsibilities, who became guerrilla nurses, as you framed them. And so I'm interested in what that meant for them. Not just what it meant practically. I'm interested in all of that process actually, but also, how they might have understood. Was that a significant transition? Was it simply doing the same thing in a different context? And then I assume that there's also a transition then to sort of the post-colonial state, and how important the work as guerrilla nurses shaped the kinds of work and the kinds of identities and relationships in nursing in the sort of that next period of people's sort of working lives. And then my other question, which you don't have to get into right now, but I hope you and I could talk about, is this sort of transnational dimension of that story, of what it meant to be working in Mozambique, and the interactions there with sort of the Mozambican sort of thinking around medicine and kind forms of medical care. But I'm sure these are things we can talk about at more length, so don't feel you have to answer it all right now.
All right. Thank you very much, Rosa, and it's great to see you again after a very long time. I would like to talk more about that transnational experience with you, and I might also want to introduce you to someone else who works on Mozambique, but that actually pitched an idea about looking at hospitals and their workers at the time of transition from colonial to post-colonial.
I think period. I know who you mean.
Yes, so I will. Yeah. Oh yes, exactly.
I just heard that he's doing this. That's very exciting. I was thinking you two in the conversation. Sorry. But
that's fine. In terms of the nurses transitioning from guerrilla nurses, it's unfortunate that I did not do an actual interview myself of these. There were nurses, but there were also medics. Like men who are just, men and women who are just trained by people such as Osho Kunze, who were some of the key doctors for Zanla, for instance. They kind of like trained their helpers, at least on site. But at least from, so I used a couple of the interviews that usually appear in the Sunday Mail. And these interviews have been going on, I think, since 2013, about the experiences of people in the Liberation War. And they have interviewed quite a number of medics and nurses, you know, in terms of their work within the bush hospitals, if you want to think as they call them. And at least for me, there are two things. First, they argue, and which is totally understandable, to say they were doing a service to the nation, right? So it's framed within the liberation kind of rhetoric. We were fighting for Zimbabwe. We're doing a service to our fellow colleagues, and you know, like, and a service to somewhere like to refugees, because they also you know, like, treated or nursed refugees within refugee camps. But also one thing, and at least that was brought by the war, was the very nature of injuries they begin to encounter. So this is something the majority had not been trained for, right? If you want to think of it, how to deal with bullet wounds, shrapnel, how to deal with poisoning. If you think of how the Rhodesians actually used poison as part and parcel of the biological warfare. So again, the majority of this had to retrain, you know, in terms of how to deal with this kind of new experiences, in terms of, you know, like, the kinds of situation they will actually find themselves in, how to remove foreign bodies now from one's body, how to deal with bullet wounds, how to deal with poisoning when a fellow guerrilla is poisoned. So there is a way in which it's a continuation. So there is a way, there is a way in which they say it's a continuation of their work, which they were doing all along, nursing the sick, but here now they're doing it as a service to the nation, right? But at the same time, they also have to go for, sometimes the training, it will take sometimes 6 months, you know, like, in terms of retraining to deal with this new situation they were encountering in, you know, like, within the war situation. In terms of the transition in the post-colonial period, you do have, and especially within the ministerial level, and especially, and also within some of the new posts that were created by the 1981 Medical Act, you do have some of these key members who were central to the bush hospital, doctors and some senior nurses, occupying these positions. And then they had to, their aim now was to implement a new nursing and hospital policy in a post-colonial society that was supposed to be socialist, but we know that, you know, like, that did not happen. So they now had to push the agenda of the new state in, you know, like, in post-colonial period. But that's an area in which I need to do further research on. I didn't have enough time, you know, like, to do research on. But thanks, Rosa, for the questions and the contribution.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rosa Williams. And thank you very much, Dr. Clement Masakure. I don't know if Dr. Chambo is still here. Yeah, yes, Dr. Chambo is still with us. This is your time. I guess Dr. Valentine Chambo no longer wants to ask the question. But viewers and listeners, this is your time. I'm taking 2 last questions before we get to close. Let me invite Anna West with a question for Dr. Clement Masakure. This is your time.
Thank you so much. Hi, Dr. Masakure. It's nice to see you.
Hi, Dr. West.
I was very interested in what you said about translation, and it reminded me of Prof. Kalusa's article about
Right.
at Manilungu. And I wondered if you could reflect for us a little bit on the figure of the intermediary and the ways in which you find that useful or insufficient to think about agency in the material that you're working with.
All right. Yeah, Anna, that's yeah, that's a very, very fascinating and a bit difficult question. If we think about translation, at least in my, like how I present it in my book, it's you have to think about the positionality, right, of the nurse, that in the sense that they're in the middle of a white medical doctor, a white matron, white government official, who in most cases does not have, first of all, has not mastered the language. This is just the normal language that either Shona and Ndebele or Shona and its various dialects. So in other words, they need someone who's able to literally translate, what the patient is saying and translate back. So that's like at one level. So you see, for instance, I have a case of Dr. Geni and Mr. Job Tsiga, who Dr. Geni trained starting 1903, and Job Tsiga was very central in the work of Dr. Geni until he died in 1923, and he continued, with the work. So there is the actual translation in terms of you have someone who, translate, someone is suffering from this and that. But then you also have to think about conceptually about how people sit and explain illnesses. In terms of, there's certain, and especially within Shona and Ndebele, cultures, how someone might explain a particular form of illness. So sometimes it's not very straight to the point. It's, I have 1, 2, 3, and this 1, 2, 3 is also causing this 1, 2, 3 and whatever, right? And within, or sometimes we've gone to see so-and-so, but then we moved to this place, or we went to see an indigenous healer, and then they got this and we went somewhere else. So there is a way in which sometimes, the concept of illnesses might be conceived differently. So again, you need someone who can actually then translate those kind of concepts in order for then one to be then, in order for the medical doctor then to say, I think it might be something else. But I have to be very clear that I'm not saying these people were handmade or were, what can I say, where the, no, handmade is not a nice term. I'm forgetting the term, but what I want to say is you have to think of these people as people who took a particular opportunity within a system to help their fellows, but also to improve economically and socially themselves. So they sit in this middle, they translate literally, but in terms of, literal translation, but they also translate, concepts, ideas about illness, which the doctor might not be familiar with. I don't know whether I was able to answer the question, Anna.
Sure, no, thank you. I think there's so many interesting examples that reach sort of this point, and then the question that we can maybe take up further later is around whether we're reading sort of agency and resistance in ways that are accurate to the setting. But
right, I think it's very difficult I think in terms of agency, you can, if you think of in terms of agency, you can, one, we can actually argue about the very idea of saying, I want to work as, you know, like as as a nursing orderly, especially for the first generation men and women, and for men, instead of, for instance, going and work on the mines, or to go and work in town and say, you know, like, I want to work, we can think of it some as a form of agency, you know, like in the sense that it's something which they feel they want to do, and they, you know, they feel like they're going to contribute, and they feel they're in charge of, you know, like of their own life. It's a decision in which actually they make.
Thank you.
I can't hear you, Anotida. Please unmute yourself.
I think you can hear me now, right?
Uh-huh.
That is wonderful. Thank you very much, Anna, for the question. I'm afraid we are running out of time, but I'm going to take the last question from Mr. Nicholas Nyachega, who joins us from the University of Minnesota with a question. This is your time.
Thank you, Anutida. Thank you, Clement, for this talk. I apologize, I've missed a huge part of it, but I was just wondering if this is something that you've talked about or you are considering in your work, how nurses, for example, kind of, you know, deal with social boundaries in the communities they work with. Yes, they are working from the hospital or from the clinic, but they have a community to work with in their everyday lives. So what do you think about the power relations between Indigenous leaders and the nurse as a person of power in a community?
All right. Yeah, that's kind of a difficult question to you know, like to answer, Nick, in the sense that most of the nurses I interviewed were nurses who worked, and especially in government hospitals and some mission hospitals within urban areas. So the element of the Indigenous leader actually falls out. But what I can say in terms of social boundaries, in terms of dealing with communities, I want us to think of the significance of the profession itself in terms of how it was viewed by the community as a, first, even in rural areas, the power that it wields. And the authority I've mentioned about the idea of nurses as being de facto medical authorities in areas where medical doctors were not available or come time often. So in other words, these are, to be honest, very powerful people, because they determine whether one gets medication or not. Now, the extent to which there might have been friction with local leaders, that I cannot say. But what I can say is nursing was held in high esteem. It was seen as more or less as an exemplary job. And for women, it actually even gave them more prestige than, you know, like than other women. If I can quote Cephas Msipa in his book, in his memoir, he talks about the first time he bought a car. And it was a Zephyr, and he did not know how to drive. But luckily, he had a colleague by the name of Robert Mugabe, who had a driver's license. And Robert Mugabe drove Cephas Msipa to Harare Hospital, just to, you know, almost, if you want to think of it, just to display their newfound wealth, or the new acquisition, sorry. And Cephas Msipa is very clear that they went to Harare Hospital because nurses look down upon us as teachers, and I want to show them that us as teachers, and this is a male teacher, I have achieved something. So somehow it shows about how that kind of a profession was viewed within African communities. If you go through the archives and of the 1930s and 1940s, there are numerous complaints from, and especially from missionary white nurses who are complaining about African nursing orderlies, arguing that because sometimes they do have a stethoscope, they move around with it in rural areas and actually acting or playing the act of being a medical doctor. So in other words, there is a power and authority to which, the profession wields, which then these, it might come again to the issue, which the issue of urgency, which Anna asked, which these men and women actually then tapped into and presented it, like as, like people of high status within the African communities. I hope I did not digress so much from you, what you expected, Nick.
No, thank you for that response.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clement Masakure. Viewers and listeners, this was Dr. Clement Masakure's presentation of his newly published book, African Nurses and Everyday Work in 20th Century Zimbabwe. This book was published by Manchester University Press in 2020. I'm going to paste the link to the direct access of this book on our YouTube page and on our Facebook page. And those of you who might want to continue having a discussion and commenting about this book, and as well as engaging with Dr. Clement Masakure, please feel free to post your comments and many of the other questions. This is the platform where I get to sit with established academics to have a discussion of their outstanding publications and other top issues of the day. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me, and have a good day.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. I'm so honored to have you guys. Thank you.
That is wonderful.
See you, Clement.
See you, Munya. Thanks.
Nice to see you. Nice to see you, Anna.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.